The letter sat on my kitchen counter like a bomb waiting to go off. The bold letters across the top screaming notice of violation, as if someone had decided I was guilty before I had a chance to even read it.
Ow.
My fingers trembled slightly. As I flipped through the thick packet stapled together, each page filled with accusations of supposed violations, all tied neatly with a massive fine that added up to $250,000. I had to read the number several times to make sure my eyes weren't playing tricks on me. $250,000, as if some neighborhood board could suddenly dictate my financial existence. My first instinct was to laugh because surely this had to be some kind of joke. But as I looked closer at the signatures and the threats of liens and legal action, I realized they weren't playing. They actually thought they had the power to do this to me. That was when I decided I wasn't just going to fight them, I was going to destroy every bit of arrogance this so-called HOA had built its power on. And here's the kicker they didn't know yet. The twist that would unravel their entire little empire. The neighborhood they governed with an iron fist. The manicured lawns, the gleaming driveways, the private lakefront they treated like a sacred temple. It was all sitting on land that I owned outright. Land my family had held for generations. Land they leased without even realizing the man they were threatening with fines was the very landlord who held the deed to their kingdom. Before I dive deeper, let me say this. See if you enjoy seeing arrogance get put in its place and bullies crushed under the weight of their own hubris. Make sure you stay with me through every part of this story because you won't believe the way it unfolds, and I promise you'll want to hear every twist. And if you want more stories where HOA Karens meet their match, don't forget to subscribe to Sham Stories right now, because this is just the beginning. It all started when I received that notice on a humid Monday morning delivered by certified mail, as if they wanted to make the whole affair look more legitimate than it was. The violations listed were absurd to the point of comedy. They accused me of building a shed without approval, when the shed in question was an old barn that had stood for over 80 years. A relic of my grandfather's cattle business. They fined me for grass growing too high along a section of my pasture, a place I specifically let run wild for wildlife and to protect the soil. They even cited me for improper fencing, though the split rail wood had been there long before their association even existed. And yet somehow they claimed jurisdiction over me, claiming that my land fell under their house rules. But here's where it got interesting. The land they were referencing wasn't part of their legally platted subdivision. My ranch stretched out for miles, and over time developers had carved up pieces of it, buying parcels to build their gated lakefront community. But the mistake they made, and the thing they never seemed to care about, was that the ground beneath their homes, streets, and parks still tied back to one primary land title mine. I leased the parcels through a series of contracts, and as long as the payments flowed, they thought they ruled the roost. When I drove through the neighborhood later that day, I noticed how smugly perfect everything was. The freshly mowed lawns, cut into identical squares, the mailboxes lined up in precision, the speed limit signs warning HOA enforced. It felt less like a neighborhood and more like a dictatorship with vinyl siding. At the center of it all was the clubhouse, a gaudy, two-story structure with white columns and a massive balcony that looked out over the lake. That was their throne room, the place where their board led by the infamous Karen. Their HOA president handed out punishments like royalty scolding peasants. Karen was a woman who thrived on control, someone who couldn't walk down the street without pointing out a neighbor's lawn ornament that violated aesthetic standards. I'd seen her once before. A sharp-featured woman in her 50s with a permanent scowl etched into her forehead, barking orders to landscapers like she owned the place. When I pulled up to their clubhouse parking lot later that week to attend their mandatory compliance meeting, I was greeted with stares and whispers. It wasn't often that an outsider showed up unannounced, especially someone like me, who wore dusty boots and a flannel shirt instead of the pressed khakis and polo shirts that seemed to be their neighborhood uniform. Karen stood at the podium. When I entered, flanked by a board of 5 other members who looked just as self-important. "Mr. Daniels," she said, drawing out my last name like it was a curse, "we're glad you finally joined us. You've racked up quite a list of violations, and we're here to resolve them." I smiled and took a seat in the back, crossing my arms casually. "Oh, I read the list," I said, my voice carrying through the room. Pretty ambitious of you to think you can find me for my own land. Her eyes narrowed. Your property falls within the jurisdiction of the Lakeview Homeowners Association. You signed when you purchased, therefore you agreed to abide by our standards. That's when I let out a laugh that echoed through the room. That's cute, I said. But here's the problem. I never purchased property in Lakeview. You all purchased your property from developers who leased it from me. I didn't sign anything because I don't live here. Own the land under your feet. For a second, the room froze, as if no one could process what I'd just said. Karen shook her head. That's impossible. We control the land within this subdivision. Do you? I said, pulling a folded document from my jacket. Because according to this deed and these contracts, all you control are the homes and the improvements, the ground beneath them, the lakeshore, the streets there, all under my master title. Which means, technically, every time you send me a violation notice, you're trespassing into business that's not yours. The murmurs started then, people whispering to one another, eyes darting nervously. Karen's face flushed red. That doesn't change the fact that you're in violation, she snapped, clinging desperately to her authority. Karen, I said slowly, letting my words sink in. You fined me $250,000 for supposed violations on my land? But here's what you don't understand. You don't have the right to enforce anything on me. In fact, if we want to. Get technical. I have more leverage over you than you could ever have over me. Because if I wanted to, I could sell off this entire neighborhood right out from under you. The silence that followed was deafening. People shifted uncomfortably. Board members glanced at one another with pale faces, and Karen's lips pressed. Together so tightly, they disappeared into a thin line. For the first time, I saw doubt in her eyes, a crack in the armor of her arrogance. But instead of backing down, she doubled down. We'll see about that, she said, her voice trembling, but firm. We have lawyers. We have power. Can't just threaten an entire community. I stood, tucking the papers back into my jacket. I'm not threatening, I said calmly. I'm reminding you where your power really comes from. You think you're untouchable, but you've been building your empire on ground you don't own. And when I'm done, you're going to wish you never tried to find me in the first place. As I walked out of that room, I felt every eye follow me, the weight of the revelation sinking in. They had no idea what kind of storm they had unleashed, no clue that the man they thought they could bully with fines and threats was the one person who had the ability to pull the rug out from under their entire neighborhood. And as for Karen, I could tell by the look on her face that she wasn't going to let it go quietly. But neither was I. The fallout from the first HOA meeting where Karen and her board slapped me with that absurd $250,000 fine was still hanging thick in the air as I stepped back onto my land. But I wasn't rattled, in fact. I was more amused than angry because, while they thought they had me cornered, I already knew what they didn't. I was the actual owner of every property in that neighborhood, a silent landlord whose name they'd never bothered to look up because they were too busy feeding their egos. And that knowledge gave me a calm sense of control while they were blind with arrogance. So instead of wasting time ranting, I began documenting everything, pulling out my phone to record video of the freshly posted violation notices plastered across my property line, each one claiming I'd broken HOA rules despite the fact that my land was never under their jurisdiction. And with every piece of evidence I gathered, my case against them grew stronger. But the real victory wasn't going to be in proving my innocence, it was going to be in showing them exactly how wrong they were about who really held the power in this neighborhood. The next morning, as the sun rose over the lake, I sipped coffee on my porch and watched Karen patrol the street like some self-appointed sheriff, strutting in her pressed blazer with a clipboard clutched to her chest, barking at her little group of HOA loyalists about lawn heights and mailbox paint colors. And I couldn't help but laugh at the irony of her trying to enforce control over land that legally belonged to me. The very person she was trying to bully, and I realized she was operating in total ignorance. She had no idea that the man she fined into oblivion was the landlord of the homes she and her fellow board members lived in. And that ignorance was about to cost them dearly. By mid-morning, an envelope arrived at my door, hand-delivered by one of the HOA volunteers. And inside was an official notice of enforcement stating that if I didn't pay the fine within 30 days, the HOA would pursue a lien against my property, and I almost choked on my laughter. Because not only could they not legally enforce that against my private land, but if they tried to put a lien on the very neighborhood I owned, they'd be effectively tying themselves into a legal noose. So instead of responding immediately, I tucked the letter away and let them think they were tightening the screws, all the while preparing my own counterstrike. That afternoon, I drove into town and met with my attorney, a sharp, nonsense man named Richard who had helped me handle dozens of property deals over the years. And when I slid the HOA's letter across his desk, his eyebrows shot up, and then he leaned back and let out a long, low whistle before saying, "They really have no idea who they're messing with, do they?" And I shook my head, grinning as he chuckled and began outlining how we could respond. First, by drafting a cease and desist order reminding them they had no authority over my land. And second, by quietly preparing a motion to dissolve their HOA. Altogether, since their entire operation depended on property deeds and agreements that I, as the legal owner, could revoke at will, and Richard's grin grew even wider as he said, "If you want to, we can make them dance to your tune before this is over." By the time I left his office, the plan was clear. Let Karen and her cronies dig themselves deeper, keep documenting their threats and bogus fines. And when the time was right, flip the switch and reveal that every mansion, every lawn, every lakefront lot they thought they ruled over was actually under my name, and that their so-called HOA kingdom was nothing more than a fragile illusion built on arrogance and ignorance. The very next day, Karen escalated her campaign against me, showing up at my gate with 2 uniformed security guards she had apparently hired to monitor compliance. And while the guards stood awkwardly at her side, clearly unsure about the legality of what they were doing, Karen puffed out her chest and shouted through the gate that I had 72 hours to rectify the violations, or the HOA would move to seize my property. And instead of engaging with her nonsense, I simply lifted my phone, hit record, and asked her to repeat every word for the camera, which she foolishly did, her voice dripping with smugness as she declared her authority. And when I ended the recording and calmly told her, "You really don't know who you're talking to," she smirked and walked off, muttering something about teaching me a lesson. Later that evening, I sent the video to Richard, who called me within minutes, laughing so hard he could barely speak, before saying, "She just handed you the rope to hang their entire HOA with," and I knew he was right, because now I had them on record making illegal threats under the guise of authority they didn't possess. And once the court saw this, their credibility would be obliterated. But even with that evidence in my pocket, I didn't rush to end things. I wanted Karen and her board to feel the pressure, to think they were winning, because the higher they climbed on their imaginary throne, the harder the fall would be when I pulled the rug out from under them. And so I sat back, biding my time, watching as they plastered more notices around the neighborhood, bragging at meetings about how they were cracking down on rule breakers, and completely unaware that the man they thought they were punishing was the one who held the deed to their million-dollar homes. By the end of the week, I attended another HOA meeting, this time not as a victim, but as a silent observer. Sitting in the back, as Karen ranted to her board about law and order and protecting property values, her voice rising with each word as she whipped the room into a frenzy. And while they applauded her speeches, I simply took notes, recording every empty threat and every baseless fine they announced, knowing it would all serve as ammunition when I finally revealed the truth. When the meeting ended, Karen spotted me and strutted over, her face twisted with smug satisfaction, and she leaned in close, whispering, "You might as well give up now. You'll never win against us." And I smiled slowly, meeting her eyes, as I replied, "You're absolutely right, because you've already lost. You don't even know it yet," before walking out, leaving her fuming in confusion. That night, as I sat on my porch looking out over the lake, I thought about how this battle was more than just about a ridiculous fine or a power-hungry. HOA 8 was about exposing bullies who thrived on intimidation and control, showing them that the world didn't revolve around their petty rules. And as the moonlight shimmered across the water, I felt a sense of calm resolve settle over me, because I knew the war was just beginning, and when it ended, it wouldn't be me paying. $250,000 it would be Karen and her HOA, begging me for mercy when I held the future of their neighborhood in my hands. The week after the heated confrontation with the HOA board members, I found myself reflecting on the strange irony of the situation. They had fined me nearly $250,000 for supposed violations, threatened to place liens on my property, and even hinted at legal action, yet all the while they had no idea that the ground they walked on, the homes they lived in, and the roads they drove across were owned by me. I was their landlord, the sole title holder to the entire neighborhood's land. And this meant that their attempts to fine me were nothing more than a power play built on ignorance. Still, I knew I had to tread carefully. Power, especially when held by arrogant people like Karen and her cronies, made them reckless. And reckless people can cause real damage if not handled correctly. I gathered my legal team again, this time to draft a comprehensive review of the HOA's charter bylaws. In every deed restriction they claimed to enforce, I wanted to know exactly how far their reach extended and whether their overreach could be turned into leverage for me. My attorney, James, returned a few days later with a thick file and a sly grin. "They don't have a leg to stand on," he told me confidently. "Yes. Their fines are based on fabricated rules that don't align with any county or state statute. And worse, their HOA was never properly incorporated as a nonprofit entity. It means their board technically doesn't exist in the eyes of the law. They've been bluffing everyone into compliance, and now that you own the land itself, you've got them pinned. They can't enforce fines against their landlord." Hearing this, I felt a surge of relief and satisfaction. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about all the other homeowners who had probably been scammed for years into paying fines that weren't legally valid. Karen and her board had built their empire on intimidation, not legitimacy, and it was finally going to come crashing down. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for that Thursday, and I decided I would attend. I wanted to look Karen in the eye while I dismantled her charade. When I arrived, the clubhouse was packed with anxious residents. Some had folders stuffed with fine notices, others whispered angrily about rising HOA dues, and a few looked genuinely fearful, as though speaking up against Karen might ruin their lives. Karen, as always, sat front and center, a self-satisfied smirk plastered across her face. She rapped her gavel against the table, demanding silence, and immediately began railing against me. "We have a landowner here who has blatantly violated our community standards," she announced to the crowd. "His refusal to pay the $250,000 in fines endangers us all, and we may have no choice but to pursue foreclosure proceedings if he continues this behavior." Gasps echoed through the room. People looked at me with a mix of curiosity and pity. Karen clearly thought she had the upper hand, but I let her finish her rant before standing slowly. "Foreclosure proceedings?" I asked, my voice calm, but loud enough to silence the room. "On land that you don't even own?" Karen's smirk faltered for the first time. "Excuse me?" she snapped. I pulled out a set of papers from my briefcase and held them high for everyone to see. "Ladies and gentlemen, what Karen hasn't told you is that your HOA board has no legal standing, their incorporation papers are invalid, her fines are fraudulent. And the land this neighborhood sits on, the roads, the lakes, the trails, it all belongs to me. You've been paying fines and dues to an organization that has no legitimate authority." The room erupted into chaos. Some homeowners stood in shock. Some shouted at Karen, demanding answers, and others turned their attention to me, asking if what I said was true. Karen slammed her gavel again, her face red with rage. "This is nonsense!" she shrieked. "He's just trying to distract you from his violations. Don't listen to him." But her panic betrayed her. People began yelling over her, demanding to see proof of incorporation, demanding to know where their money had gone. I handed copies of James's legal findings to a few residents in the front row, who began reading them aloud. Every word confirmed what I had said. Karen's empire of control was crumbling right in front of her. When she realized she couldn't silence the crowd, she turned her fury back on me. "You think you're clever, don't you?" she hissed, her voice dripping with venom. "Well, landlord or not, we'll find a way to deal with you. This is my community, and you won't take it away from me." I couldn't help but chuckle at her delusion. "Karen," I replied, locking eyes with her, "you never had this community. You manipulated it, and I think it's about time. Residents here know the truth, and I'm more than happy to help them untangle the mess you've created." After that meeting, the neighborhood was in turmoil. Emails and group chats lit up with residents demanding Karen step down, people asking me for guidance, and others wondering what this revelation meant for their future. I didn't want to overstep. I had no interest in running their lives the way Karen had, but I also felt a responsibility to ensure they weren't left adrift. Over the next few days, I organized an open forum at the community center. Unlike Karen's meetings, I allowed everyone to speak freely. Residents shared horror stories of being fined for leaving trash cans out, for paint colors on their houses, even for planting the wrong type of flowers. Some had paid thousands of dollars over the years, all of it funneled into Karen's HOA accounts. Others admitted they had been too scared to speak up because Karen threatened legal action or public humiliation. By the end of the night, one thing was clear: Karen and her board had been running a scam, and the neighborhood was ready to be free of her control. But Karen wasn't about to go quietly. The very next morning, she plastered the neighborhood with flyers accusing me of being a con artist who was trying to seize control of the community. She wrote that I was lying about owning the land, that I was only trying to avoid paying my fines, and that I planned to bulldoze their homes if I got my way. It was an outrageous smear campaign, but I had expected nothing less from her, I responded. Not with flyers or counterattacks, but with facts. My legal team prepared certified copies of the land ownership records, which we delivered to every resident's mailbox. Alongside the documents, I included a simple letter. "I am not here to control you. I am here to protect you. Your HOA has no legal standing, and I have no interest in imposing rules on how you live. This is your home. Don't let fear blind you to the truth." That approach resonated more than I imagined. Neighbors began stopping me on the street too. Thank me. Some even offered to band together to file a class action lawsuit against Karen for the money she had illegally taken. For the first time in a long while, people were hopeful instead of fearful. Karen, however, was seething. She doubled down on her lies, calling emergency meetings, threatening lawsuits, and even trying to rally the few loyalists she had left to confront me directly. One evening, I found her standing at the edge of my driveway with two of her board members, shouting about how she would take me down. I simply recorded her rant on my phone and then handed the footage to the sheriff's office the next morning. They informed me she had no legal right to harass me on my property and promised to issue a warning if she continued. That only seemed to make her more desperate. I could tell she felt the ground slipping away from under her, and desperate people often make reckless moves. The tension in the neighborhood was palpable, but beneath it, I sensed a shift. For the first time, the residents were united, not under Karen's control, but in opposition to it. They wanted accountability, they wanted freedom, and they wanted their neighborhood back. And I was determined to make sure they got it. The $250,000 fine Karen had tried to hang over my head had become the very weapon that would expose her. What she didn't know yet was that I had already begun building a case not just to dissolve her HOA, but to hold her personally liable for fraud. The game she thought she controlled was about to be flipped upside down, and the final moves were mine to make. By the time the next HOA meeting rolled around, the tension in the neighborhood was so thick that even those who had supported Karen and her leadership style were starting to question her judgment, especially since word of my supposed fines had spread like wildfire, and now everyone was buzzing with curiosity about what I was going to do next. What they didn't realize was that I wasn't just going to walk into that meeting with a complaint or a petition like some frustrated homeowner. I was going to step in with documents, proof, and the kind of power that nobody in that room would be able to dismiss. I remember walking through the double doors of the community clubhouse, the sound of voices instantly softening as heads turned my way, their eyes filled with both curiosity and disdain, because I was still being painted as some kind of rogue who refused to bow to the HOA's rules. Karen was at the front, perched behind the long table like a queen on her throne, her smug smile plastered across her face, as if she were convinced she had already won. The moment I took a seat, she wasted no time in trying to humiliate me. loudly announcing that this meeting would cover serious business, including my continued refusal to comply with the $250,000 fine she described as a matter of community respect. Her voice carried with exaggerated authority, and I could tell she thought the crowd would back her up, but instead, I could see cracks forming, neighbors exchanging uncomfortable glances, others whispering quietly, and some simply folding their arms in defiance of her arrogance. I let her have her moment, though, sitting there quietly with my folder of documents, biding my time, because I knew the impact would be stronger if I let her dig herself into a deeper hole before I lowered the hammer. She went on for nearly 20 minutes, accusing me of setting a bad example, of jeopardizing property values, of being disruptive to the harmony of the neighborhood, until finally, when she smugly declared that if I didn't pay up, the HOA would escalate matters to the courts. I stood up and let the room fall silent as all eyes shifted to me. I opened the folder slowly, deliberately, and pulled out the first document titled "Did Not," just for my property, but for the entire neighborhood purchased years ago as part of a larger land deal. The moment I said the words "I own this land," the collective gasp in the room was almost comical, like something out of a stage drama, but the shock on Karen's face was priceless. Her confident smirk cracked, her lips parting slightly as she blinked rapidly, trying to process what I had just said. I explained calmly that while the homeowners did own their individual houses, the land beneath them, the lots, the roads, the lakes, the trails, were mine, leased out through a series of agreements that predated the formation of their HOA. I handed copies of the documents to the board members, making sure Karen got one last, because I wanted her to be the last to understand just how badly she had miscalculated. Some of the neighbors leaned forward, scanning the documents with wide eyes, whispering in disbelief. Others looked directly at Karen, suddenly realizing that their so-called leader had been flexing power she didn't actually have. For years, Karen had convinced everyone that she controlled the neighborhood. But in truth, the foundation of her entire empire was sitting on ground she didn't own. And I made it clear to everyone in that room that the $250,000 fine she had slapped on me was not only unenforceable, but laughable. Since the very association she ran operated on land I had the legal right to reclaim at any moment. Karen tried to recover, stammering out accusations that the documents were fake, that I had forged them to scare people, but her words sounded weak, desperate, and hollow in comparison to the weight of the stamped legal papers I had presented. A few board members began questioning her directly, asking why she had never disclosed this, why she had claimed ultimate authority when she clearly didn't have it. And suddenly, Karen's confident facade crumbled further as she grew defensive, snapping at her own allies and insisting that I was trying to destroy the community. But the damage was already done. The room was no longer under her control, and I seized the moment to lay out my plan. I told everyone that I had no intention of evicting them or making their lives difficult. In fact, I valued the neighborhood and wanted it to thrive, but I wasn't going to tolerate an HOA that abused its residents, levied ridiculous fines, and acted like a dictatorship. If the community wanted to continue under Karen's leadership, that was their choice. They needed to understand that I held the final authority and that their HOA had no legal standing to impose anything on me or anyone else without my consent. The silence that followed was thick and heavy, broken only by a few murmurs of agreement from neighbors who had long been tired of Karen's antics. I could see relief washing over some faces, almost as if they finally had an escape from the constant harassment of fines and arbitrary rules. Karen, however, wasn't ready to give up. Her voice rose with venom as she accused me of blackmail, of threatening the stability of their homes. But the more she ranted, the more foolish she sounded, especially when one of her own board members asked her directly why she had never bothered to verify the ownership of the land in the first place. She froze, unable to answer, and that was the final crack in her armor. I stepped back then, letting the tension of the moment sink in, and quietly told the room that from that day forward, things were going to change, because I wasn't going to allow an HOA to bully me or anyone else's on property that was legally mine. And as I walked out of that meeting, leaving behind a stunned and divided group, I knew this was only the beginning, because while Karen had been publicly exposed, She wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully. She would regroup, retaliate, and come after me with everything she had, and I had to be ready to counter her every move. The next morning I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in months, as though every cloud of doubt had burned away under the fire of the HOA's arrogance, and I knew it was time to make them face reality. They thought their $250,000 fine would be the last word, but it was really the opening sentence in the story of their downfall. I had all the legal paperwork ready, the deeds that proved I owned the land beneath their entire neighborhood, the contracts showing that I had purchased it years ago when the previous developer defaulted, and the legal right to control what happened to every square inch of the place they strutted around in like they were royalty. While they held their meetings, wrote citations, screamed about my so-called violations, I was quietly holding the very foundation of their lives in my hands. It was time they finally learned who really owned everything they claimed as their community. My lawyer, Diane, met me at my office, and she had the kind of grin that told me she was ready to draw blood in court. She reminded me that we didn't need to wait for another board meeting or some arbitrary HOA process. They were already in violation of their own covenants by trying to levy fines on property they had no authority over. That alone gave us the power to file an injunction that would freeze all their enforcement powers until the matter was resolved. But I wasn't interested in just freezing them. I wanted the board to feel the full humiliation of realizing they'd been trying to bully their landlord. I wanted to drag their arrogance out into the light where the whole neighborhood could see. Diane laid out the plan. We would serve them with notice of ownership, demand immediate suspension of all fines, and simultaneously file a countersuit for harassment, fraud, and illegal extortion. On top of that, I was prepared to exercise my rights as landlord to initiate lease renegotiations for their homes, which meant rent hikes that would cripple them financially if they didn't back down. As much as I wanted vengeance, this wasn't about greed. It was about teaching them that no one, no matter how loud or self-righteous, could stand above the law or above the person who actually owned the ground beneath their feet. That afternoon, I drove back to the neighborhood with Diane riding shotgun. As we pulled up, I saw Karen and her group outside the HOA clubhouse, their arms waving like they were summoning demons from the ground, their voices sharp with fake confidence. They had no idea that the tide was about to sweep them away. I parked, stepped out, and walked directly up to them, a stack of documents in my hand. Karen spun on me instantly, her face twisted in that permanent sneer she wore whenever she thought she was about to humiliate me. "Oh, look who finally showed up to face the consequences," she barked, the other board members laughing along like hyenas. "Did you bring your checkbook? You owe the HOA $250,000. And if you don't pay up by the end of the week, we'll start foreclosure proceedings. Maybe then you'll learn that rules actually matter around here." The laughter around her grew louder, but it didn't shake me. I held up the papers and said, calm as stone, "You don't have the authority to fine me, and you know why? Because you don't own this land." "I do." The laughter cut off like a switch had been flipped. Karen's eyes went wide for a second, then narrowed again, her instinct to deny kicking in before reason could catch up. "What kind of nonsense is that?" she snapped. "This is an HOA community. We make the rules here, and you're just another resident. Stop pretending you're anything more." I handed her the first set of documents, the deeds and county records stamped and verified, showing that the entirety of their neighborhood was built on land I had purchased long before their HOA had ever been formed. Diane chimed in, her voice like a hammer slamming down, explaining that every board member, every resident, is technically leasing property from me, and the HOA had been illegally overstepping their bounds by treating me like an ordinary homeowner instead of their landlord. Karen's face drained of color as she flipped through the papers, and the other board members leaned in, their whispers turning frantic. One of them, a man named Robert, who had always looked a little uncomfortable with Karen's antics, spoke up. This can't be real, can it?" Diane smiled, sharp as a knife, and replied, "It's very real, and you've all been operating under false pretenses. Every fine you've issued, every enforcement action, every threat, it's all illegal. You've been extorting the very man who owns the dirt under your houses. If you continue, you'll not only lose your board positions, but you could face criminal charges. The silence that followed was the sweetest thing I had ever heard. Karen tried to recover, puffing herself up like a cornered animal, but the cracks in her mask were obvious. Can't just walk in here and claim ownership. We've been running this neighborhood for years. The HOA has rights too, and we're not afraid to fight back. Diane laughed, a sound that cut through the tension like a blade. Fight back? Against the landlord? You've got no ground to stand on, literally. The court will see it. Same way we do. And once this goes public, you'll be lucky if your neighbors don't run you out of town for dragging them into this mess. I took a step closer, lowering my voice so it carried weight. Karen, I could end the HOA tomorrow. If I wanted to, I could raise your rents, cancel your so-called privileges, and legally evict every single one of you if you kept pushing this nonsense. I've been patient. I've let you embarrass yourselves, hoping you'd realize how foolish you've been. But now, I'm done being patient. The crowd that had gathered around us neighbors who had heard the commotion were staring with wide eyes, whispering furiously. The truth was spreading faster than wildfire, and I could see the panic settling in on the faces of the board. Their power was evaporating in real time. Karen clutched the documents, her hands trembling, but she still tried to muster a comeback. This doesn't change anything. We'll find a way around this. You can't just dismantle everything we've built. I leaned in, locking eyes with her. Everything you built was on land you didn't own, authority you never had, and power you stole. It's over, Karen. Whether you accept it now or later is up to you. But the sooner you stop, the less painful this will be for everyone. I turned and walked away, Diane at my side, leaving the stunned board and silent crowd in our wake. My phone buzzed with messages from neighbors thanking me, some even apologizing for going along with Karen's madness for so long. The truth was setting them free. And I knew this was only the beginning of the end for the HOA. The fight wasn't finished. But for the first time, Karen and her cronies understood the reality. They weren't the rulers of this neighborhood. I was. And now it was time to decide just how hard I wanted to come down on them. The storm that the HOA board thought they could ride out was finally starting to crush them under its own weight. And as I watched events spiral, I realized just how deep the cracks in their empire had grown. After their lawyers' humiliating loss in court and the revelation that their $250,000 fine against me was invalid because I legally owned the neighborhood through a holding company, the board members began turning on each other with venomous speed. Karen, who had once barked orders like she owned the sun and the sky, suddenly found herself cornered as neighbors she once bullied demanded explanations for missing HOA funds, special assessments that disappeared into thin air, and a reputation that tanked property values. Yet even with everything burning around them, Karen refused to admit defeat, rallying a small group of die-hard loyalists to fight me with one last desperate push. They tried to file appeals, drag my name through the media, and even staged a neighborhood protest on what they thought was still their land, holding signs accusing me of corruption. But the irony was too rich because, legally speaking, they were trespassing on my property while shouting about how unfair it all was. Police had no choice but to warn them, and several of them walked away in disbelief as they began to accept that the man they tried to destroy had been their landlord all along. Yet Karen didn't stop there. I got a notice one morning that she had filed an injunction claiming I had tricked the board into signing away rights and demanded the judge freeze all transactions until she could prove fraud. My lawyers laughed when they read it. Paperwork was airtight, contracts notarized, and there wasn't a shred of evidence that anything had been manipulated. The court dismissed her filing almost immediately, but her desperation bled into the entire community, fueling paranoia and mistrust. Meanwhile, I began making plans for the next stage redevelopment of the neighborhood. With full ownership, I had the right to lease, sell, or remodel, and investors were already circling. Developers wanted the lakefront properties business. Partners saw opportunity in the community clubhouse and amenities. I knew that done correctly, I could turn the HOA's kingdom into something far more valuable than they ever dreamed of. But to do that, I had to first dismantle the last vestiges of Karen's influence. And that meant stripping her of power completely. When the board called an emergency meeting in the clubhouse, I attended as the legal owner, and it was the first time many of the residents had to face me without the protective shield of Karen's lies. The room buzzed with anger, confusion, and exhaustion. One man shouted that they didn't want to live under a landlord. Another claimed I was just as bad as Karen, but before things spiraled, I laid out the truth in clear terms, explained the fraudulent fines, the illegal sale attempts, the embezzled money, and how I had exposed it all not to crush them but to protect the value of the neighborhood. I told them I had no intention of running some dictatorship like Karen's HOA, and that they would have the option to lease back their homes under fair contracts or sell at above market rates if they chose to leave. Some faces softened, others hardened, but at least for the first time, they were hearing facts instead of Karen's twisted stories. Karen, sitting in the front row, couldn't take it. She leaped up, pointing her finger at me and shouting that I was a liar, that I forged documents, and that I was stealing their lives. The crowd murmured uneasily, and I calmly pulled out the deed, the notarized contracts, and the court rulings. The truth laid bare in front of everyone was more devastating than any argument I could make. And slowly, I saw Karen's once iron grip on the crowd crumble into dust. Neighbors whispered, some openly glaring at her, realizing they had been following a woman who dragged them into financial ruin. When the meeting ended, the board was officially dissolved, placed by a transitional committee that I appointed to oversee lease agreements and development talks. Karen stormed out, screaming that she would never leave, that she would fight me to her dying breath. But her threats meant little now. Legally, she had no power, no funds, and no allies strong enough to carry her forward. Days later, I began signing contracts with developers, each deal carefully structured to ensure I maximized profit while maintaining a smooth transition for residents who wanted to stay. Yet even as the gears of progress turned, Karen waged her war in the background. She called the press again, spinning wild stories about corruption and tyranny. She filed police reports accusing me of harassment, which went nowhere. And in a final act of recklessness, she broke into the clubhouse one night with two of her supporters, vandalizing equipment and spray-painting slogans on the walls like some angry teenager trying to make a point. Unfortunately for her, the cameras I had installed caught everything. The police arrived quickly, and this time she wasn't let off with a warning. She was arrested, handcuffed in front of neighbors who gathered to watch, and booked on charges of trespassing, vandalism, and property destruction. It was a poetic image. The woman who had called the cops on countless residents for petty HOA violations finally being hauled away in the back of a squad car. Some neighbors cheered. Others shook their heads. But one thing was clear. Karen's reign was officially over. As I watched her being driven away, I couldn't help but feel the surreal weight of the journey. Months ago, she and her board tried to destroy me with a $250,000 fine, believing their HOA had limitless power. Now I stood as the rightful owner of their entire neighborhood, while she faced criminal charges and financial ruin. But the story wasn't finished yet, because the final piece of my plan was about to unfold, the redevelopment project that would reshape the community forever. Investors wanted it, residents feared it, and I knew that how I handled it would determine not just my profit, but my legacy in this fight. The stage was set for the ultimate ending, turning the HOA's ashes into something no one could have imagined, while leaving Karen to stew in the very consequences she created. The courtroom was silent, except for the steady tapping of the judge's gavel against the wood as the HOA's last desperate plea was heard, their attorney fumbling over hollow arguments that had been shredded over the weeks of trial, their documents exposed as fraudulent, their fines exposed as arbitrary. Their so-called authority revealed to be nothing more than smoke and mirrors held together by arrogance and intimidation. And as the judge leaned forward, his eyes locked on the HOA board, members trembling in their seats, he declared in no uncertain terms that every fine, every action, and every attempt to strip me of my property was null and void, further ordering that not only would the HOA pay back damages amounting to millions for the harassment and fraud they had inflicted upon me, but also that their entire neighborhood, yes, every home, every lot, and every lakefront mansion was officially under my ownership due to the purchase agreements and contracts they had ignored. thinking I was bluffing all along, and the audible gasp that rippled across the courtroom as the homeowners realized the gravity of the judge's words was the sound of victory. Justice and poetic irony colliding into one unforgettable moment. Karen, the once proud president, clutched her pearls and fell back into her chair, her face pale as the reality sank in that she wasn't just fined or embarrassed, she was officially renting from the very man she had tried to destroy. Her castle of power crumbling into dust beneath her feet, and as we left the courthouse, my legal team and I didn't celebrate with champagne or cheers. We simply walked with quiet satisfaction, knowing we had stood up to bullies and beaten them at their own game. And as news spread across the town, homeowners who had once sneered at me now lined up at my office, desperate to negotiate leases, desperate to keep the roofs over their heads. But I didn't rush to crush them. Instead, I structured fair rental agreements, making sure they understood the irony of their new landlord while also ensuring no one could ever again weaponize an HOA against a rightful landowner. And in that moment, standing at the center of it all, I realized this battle was bigger than me. It was about every family that had ever been silenced or pushed out by power-hungry HOAs. And my story would be the warning, the light, and the revenge that inspired others to fight back, to not bow down. To know that justice can prevail when you refuse to surrender. So if you've made it this far into my story, remember that the fight isn't just mine, it's yours too. Because the next time an HOA Karen tries to bully you with fake fines, fraudulent documents, or empty threats, stand tall, stand firm, and remember what happened here. Because the end of my story is just the beginning of a movement. And if you want more stories like this one, make sure you subscribe to Sham Stories on YouTube, because there are plenty more battles to be told and you don't want to miss the next time justice is served in the most unexpected way.